What a way to finish up our Numbers sermon series. Whew. These final chapters are very hard to preach from, and disturbing is a good word to describe this passage from Numbers. This trip through Numbers has been a rich one, full of surprises, full of challenges. This end here, as much as I personally would just like to skip over these verses, I think it's important to look at and deal with the things that we have a hard time with. And I do have a hard time with these verses for many reasons, which I'm sure all of you do as well. And that was also expressed in Sunday school this morning. An obvious problem being that God's people killing to receive land. Couldn't God just give them good land in a peaceful manner? Couldn't there be a way for God to give them different land? Couldn't they live together somehow without all this death and destruction? These are questions I know that others have as well. And how do we reconcile this story with our understanding of Jesus's way of peace? Where are the mercies of God that are new every morning in this story? Similarly, an obvious problem is that Moses is livid, angry, appalled that women and children were saved. Does this represent our understanding of God? Probably doesn't. It doesn't represent my understanding of God. This doesn't represent my understanding of being God's people. The war was won, yet there was anger because there were still some alive. The war is over. What does it matter? Let there be some peace. Throughout the book of Numbers, there have been hard things. Often those difficult things were the people's constant mistakes in their faith. But here it is a different type of hard thing. Israelites killing. The Midianites, killing the Midianites who lived in this region, specifically the males and others. Various Midianite tribes and clans settled throughout the area, Moab down to the southwestern end of the Arabian Peninsula. They were not one large unified nation or people group. So there were other Midianites around, so it was just the Midianites in this specific location. And there was a decree that Moses gave to take all of the boy children, which would have been typical for the era for a couple of reasons. It was a male child's duty that when he grew up, he was to avenge the death of his father. And people didn't want to deal with that in the future. But it's still very, very hard to comprehend. I've been struggling with this chapter all week. I did read a comment from a Hebrew commentator, a Jewish commentator about this passage, and it was a good reminder that we need to remember that God is bigger than we can imagine, that the story of God and God's people here in Numbers, that's true here as well. It's important to remember that we can't put God into our human boxes, but that in scriptures, we are trying to understand God, and in doing so, we often put God into our human understandings because that is all we can comprehend. That is a helpful reminder, I think, that we can't quite comprehend God and God's ways, but it still makes Numbers 35 trying. It still makes me uneasy with it. And the war that we are seeing here. Maybe this is a reminder of the way of war, that this is the way earthly countries behave, even when it is God's people. With all of this death and destruction, but that is war. In this Numbers passage, I felt a bit out of sorts and lost, and was looking for some hope. I know we're not yet in Advent, but we are at the Advent of Advent, and I am in need of the hope of Advent here in Numbers. So I asked for John to be read also. I wanted to look at Jesus to help me out from this text. So I had John 18 read, where Jesus is before Pilate, and where Jesus gives a view, an idea, a concept of kingdom or realm that is so completely different than what anyone had seen before. And I wonder if we've ever seen it anywhere since or else. Because monarchies and rulers and countries often put power and dominion at the center of itself. And we find Jesus giving a different perspective, one where relationship is at the center, where ruling over is replaced with truth and relationships with each other and with God. And Jesus embodied truth of love instead of restricting of law and force. Jesus did not have an army following to enforce what he said. Jesus didn't ask for 1,000 from each tribe to go out and take out the Romans. But Jesus did have a kingdom, a realm that's not from this world, a realm where hospitality reigns. Because when there was not enough food for the gathered crowd, 5 loaves and 2 fishes became abundant amount of food, which should remind us also of God's provision of food during the years of Numbers. Jesus was representing a realm where the notion of status did not exist. A kingdom where those who have been viewed as outcast and scorned are viewed as equals and siblings. I guess I am much more comfortable, at least at times, with this idea and presentation of what God desires for all people. But there's still this disconnect with our passage from Numbers. Again, worldly kings and countries take powers from others by winning battles, or at least successful diplomacy. But Jesus does not fight, nor does he allow his followers to do so. Jesus doesn't mount a defense against those who are against him. Instead, Jesus offers an alternative. In this realm, peace reigns over war. Violence is not the first answer. It's not the second answer. It's not even a possibility of answers. In Christ's kingdom, no one will be turned away. Jesus's testimony to the truth appears throughout the Gospels. Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." And that's really the key to this shift in understanding, at least for me. In Numbers, being God's people was seen in being a country designated by God. I just described what countries do. Countries fight. Countries gain land through violence. But what Jesus introduced was not a country, a different kind of realm of a different kind of way of being God's people, an invitation worldwide to anyone to come and join a heavenly country, not an earthly one. For if it were, Jesus and Jesus's followers would probably have ended up using the world's tools for establishing and keeping power, often in violence and war. But Jesus was not of this world, and so Jesus doesn't defend himself through violence, doesn't establish his claims by violence. Jesus does not usher in God's realm by violence. Jesus doesn't make followers by violence. I want to read what one commentator said, David Luce. Rather, Jesus has come to witness to the truth that God is love, and that because we have not seen God and have such a hard time imagining God, all too often our imaginations are dominated by our experience. So rather than imagining that God is love, we imagine God to be violent because we live in a world of violence. Rather than recognize the cross as a symbol of sacrificial love. Instead, we assume it's a legal mechanism of punishing Jesus in our stead, because we have had too much experience with punitive relationships. Rather than believe that God's grace and acceptance are absolutely unconditional, we assume God offers love, power, and status only on the condition that we fear and obey. I found his explanation quite helpful, not only in understanding Jesus, but in how we understand numbers. Humans put their experiences and relate it to all sorts of things. The Israelites faced centuries of abuse, violence, and centuries of their hope being put in a box, being squelched. Their imaginations, I imagine, were affected by their experience, their history. How many times have we heard throughout the book, just let us go back to Egypt, at least we know the difficulties there. We're just going to die here in the wilderness anyway. In forming their earthly country, they use their knowledge, understanding, and experience of earthly countries. So it's no surprise that an earthly country can act in a disturbing way. And that's why I escaped to Jesus, because Jesus is not of this world, and the realm of Jesus comes from is not like an earthly country. And therefore, the followers of Jesus will not fight to bring the kingdom about by violence. We live in a world dominated by the view that the only answer to violence is more violence. And the end result of that view is death. My kingdom is not from this world, Jesus said. And comparing Jesus' own followers to soldiers from an embattled kingdom, Jesus pointed out that if he had an earthly kingdom like everyone else, he would have soldiers fighting for him. And yet he was there alone. And when Jesus did have a follower stand up and try to physically defend with the sword, Jesus told him to put the sword away. This isn't a regular kingdom. We can see that Jesus's reign is not like any kingdom that Pilate knows. Thank you, oh God, for Jesus. This still doesn't exactly get me to understand what is happening in Numbers 31. There are lots of things that are hard to understand all throughout the book. Yahweh wanted to exterminate the people for their lack of faith, for their hard-headedness, for their complaining about many things. But Moses interceded and reminded Yahweh of the characteristics everyone else had known. A deep care to bring them out of Egypt, to bring them to a home of their own for the first time in generations. And the people needed that time to build a relationship with God and with each other. They needed that time to understand what it meant to be God's people again, what their relationship was to be with God, how to live again as God's community. And Jesus gives us a different way to be community, thankfully. A different way to be in relationship with God and with each other, a clearer way of love, by giving us a different example to emulate, a different example to shape us, a complete way of being God's people. Not in a physical country, but in one that knows no boundaries, one that does not kill for country, but one that sacrifices for others. So may we, in the difficult times of the Bible, be reminded to look at Jesus, who came to show us a different way of being God's people. Amen.